We'll start, though, with the situation in Ukraine, where senior Pentagon officials have arrived to, quote, discuss efforts to end the war with Russia. The team, led by the US Army Secretary Dan Driscoll, is expected to meet the Ukrainian president, Mr. Zelensky, later. This after reports began surfacing yesterday that the US and Russia had been talking to each other about a framework peace plan. It's thought requiring significant territorial and military concessions from Ukraine. Let's speak to Andrew Levi, former senior British diplomat. Andrew, what's your take on, well, I suppose the question is what the Americans have been up to with Russia, talking to Russia essentially behind Ukraine's back?
Good morning. Yes, we don't know what's in the plan, if there is a plan, and we don't know how firm the draft plan, if it exists, is, whether it's just a starting point for wider negotiation or whether it's a take it or leave it sort of piece of paper that you put on the table. But as you say, the reporting in various media outlets overnight makes it look like the US has been doing a deal behind Ukraine's back. The deal, as reported, seems to involve Ukraine giving up substantial amounts of territory, not just what Russia has already invaded, but large chunks of what it hasn't yet invaded, and giving up its own right to self-defense effectively, because there would be strict limits placed on the Ukrainian army and weaponry, and no foreign troops would be allowed to be on Ukrainian soil to help Ukraine defend itself. I think from the US administration's point of view, again, if the reports are correct, they would say, yes, but we're going to offer Ukraine security guarantees, and it's better to have peace than continuing war. So I think that's roughly where we are at the moment.
We speak to Major General Jonathan Shaw, as well, former Assistant Chief of Defence Staff. Thanks very much indeed for coming on. What's your take on this?
Yes, we're all scrabbling to make sense of something that seems to have come out of the blue. And particularly, it seems to have been a deal stitched up between Steve Witkoff, Trump's sort of envoy, who has a background in real estate, and a guy called Kirill Dmitriev, who's head of Russia's sovereign wealth fund. So it seems to me a sort of a financial deal stitched up by two people, which shows absolutely no recognition of the cultural and political context in which they're dealing. So, and it seems to me that neither Moscow nor Washington are particularly behind this plan or expected to succeed. So I think the curious arrival of Secretary Driscoll in the country to see Zelensky, I think they'll almost be a bit embarrassed by this proposal, because it's so clearly unacceptable to the Ukrainians.
But Andrew, we should point out that there's a political context here in trouble at mill for Zelensky in terms of the corruption scandal unfolding there. So he's considered maybe weak at the moment.
Yes, there is that element, and I think it's a salutary lesson that politics and internal politics matter a lot in international affairs. President Zelensky might be perceived as weakened, both in the Kremlin and in Washington, and people who have these, I think, very misguided ideas of how to achieve peace and security in Europe and in Ukraine in particular, then see that as an opening to push this. Having said that, the reporting that we've seen suggests that the work on the plan has been going on for some time. And I would say that I think, both Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Dmitriev, they're not geopolitical experts. They don't really have a background in any of that. On the other hand, they are each their master's voices, and I think it's extremely unlikely that they've been freelancing. They may have been given wide license to discuss things, which maybe others will then narrow down later. But I think we should probably see them as representing their masters in that sense, President Trump and President Putin.
Dr. Joanna Szostek has been good enough to join us from Chatham House's Russia and Eurasia Programme. Now, I understand your political communication is your specialism. So seen through that prism, what are the Ukrainian people understanding from what their media is telling them? What's their take on where the war's going, and what's the view on this corruption scandal?
I mean, I think it's been a really bad month for Ukrainians in general. The news is just more bad news after more bad news at the moment. And the people that I've spoken to in Kiev, I mean, they had the corruption scandal break, which, reveals sort of massive theft, really, of budget money, taking it away from frontline needs where it's obviously needed. And now this, what looks like an attempt to get Ukraine to capitulate. I mean, that's how it's been presented in Ukrainian sources. And from what I've read in the media, our media describing the sort of provisional points of this so-called plan, I mean, it does look like a push to sort of get Ukraine to capitulate to most of Russia's most maximalist demands. So, yeah, I mean, the mood in Ukraine and Kiev is obviously, not good. Plus, you have, continuing strikes hitting energy facilities, blackouts in Kiev and other cities. It's really difficult there at the moment.
So you would describe the Ukrainians as demoralised as they have been since this all started?
I mean, I would say Ukraine is a remarkably resilient country, and, there is still a very high level of determination not to capitulate. So, I mean, that needs stressing above all else. I think Ukrainians, for the most part, recognize what capitulation would mean. It would not be peace. It would be essentially a complete loss of sovereignty, occupation, then persecution of people who'd, fought for the Ukrainian side. I mean, it's just not a future that people want to think about or envisage. So the will to fight is still there. But I mean, the news from the front is not positive at the moment at all. And this, the sort of negotiations going on between the US and Russia without the Europeans there, without Ukraine at the table, none of that looks good at all from a Ukrainian perspective.
And Jonathan, with your military hat on, the situation on the ground is what at the moment, and how's that informing events?
Yes, well, Ukraine is facing a very difficult choice as to whether to keep defending Pokrovsk or whether to pull out. And it's the old question. I mean, the Ukrainian tactic throughout this war really has been to hang on to ground as long as possible, as long as they can in order to attrit the Russians as much as possible. And that's held true in many places. So the hope is that by attriting the Russian forces, and the Russians continue to take monumental numbers of casualties, certainly many more than Ukrainians, that Russia will lose the will to fight. I think the trouble with that position is that Putin does not seem to care how many of his people he loses to make slow gains. And he's put such political capital on making the success of this operation that I for one, don't see him backing out of that until such time as there's a loss of political support back home in Moscow and Petersburg.
And Andrew, I know you were in charge of advising, or part of advising David Miliband and Gordon Brown after Putin's invasion of Georgia in 2008, where, Putin was, at his business back then, but the whoever was in the White House was of the traditional, American president sort of role, heavily managed by their advisors and so on. With Trump, nobody quite knows what's going to happen, and it's an approach which has enjoyed some success, in solving, or at least, I don't know, helping to show the beginnings of the possibilities of solving some pretty intractable conflicts.
Yes, I would say two things. One is that Putin's been around a long time, and it's easy to imagine that because he's been around for a long time, he'll therefore continue to successfully stay on and do what he wants to do. But, losing political support, as was just mentioned, is a bit like going bankrupt. At first it happens very slowly, and then, it happens suddenly. And I think Putin's under a lot of pressure. It's very difficult back home. He's taking the huge losses that have been mentioned. And one can imagine that he doesn't care, but actually this is all building up, and he's I think there's a strong sense that some people in Moscow think they're running out of time. And so they grasp at an opportunity like this because they want to get a quick fix that gets the maximum amount of their demands in, and try to get some kind of win from what's been really a disastrous invasion. But the other side of it is, as you say, the US president and the traditional US approach to Europe, which has been, let's say, since 1945, certainly since the 1940s, that Europe is absolutely essential to US security. And that remains true for fundamental reasons that we could discuss at greater length another time. If aggressive war in Europe is rewarded, it leads to unforeseeable, but definitely to instability. Unforeseeable in its details, but there'll be great problems in Europe if this is allowed to happen, if this victory, if you like, semi-victory for Russia is given in Ukraine. And so the question for President Trump and his team is, do they want security in Europe? If they don't, they must have a different view of the world than the US has had for all that time. But based on what? And I think really, if you look at it from the point of view of US interests, not rewarding this Russian aggression should be their top priority. And I fear that it perhaps isn't. So goodness knows, as you say, what will President Trump do? And I think none of us do know.
And Joanna, briefly, what are the Russian people being told by their media? And, other media is available to them. I think they're not sort of locked out of the world's media like many of the Chinese are, for example.
That is now less true than it used to be. Before 2022, the Russians did have access to a sort of decent range of relatively independent sources and international sources. But since 2022, the restrictions on the internet in Russia have really intensified. And I would say it is actually now quite hard for the average Russian to get any kind of alternative view from the state view. You can go on sources like Telegram, where you get a lot of disinformation type sources and, that kind of thing as well. But the Russian state tells their citizens a lot of lies about Ukraine and have been doing that for a very long time. They won't read in the Russian media about Ukrainian civilians being killed by Russian missiles. That kind of thing is absent. They will read about essentially Russians, getting rid of Nazis in Ukraine, because they frame, the Russian media have for a long time framed the Ukrainian population as Nazi supporters, which is obviously not true. That remains a long-term challenge. The views of the Russian population towards Ukraine and towards the Ukrainian people are extremely distorted because of the propagandistic nature of the Russian media.
Okay, thank you all very much, Dr. Joanna Szostek from the Chatham House, Jonathan Shaw, former Assistant Chief of the Defence Staff, and Andrew Levi, former senior British diplomat. It's 11:20.